Well, The Returns is a story really about two characters in particular. And it's one of the things I like to do as a structural component in writing, is have two characters which play off each other. And in this case, they're two characters who have things in their past they want to reconcile themselves with. And they share, finally, a house. They're not lovers, they're not even friends, but it turns out that the character Trevor moves into Elizabeth's house as a lodger. And he particularly likes the fact that she's got a garage in the back. And the garage isn't used, it's just a shed and it's pretty derelict, but he turns it into a kind of studio to do a bit of painting in. One of his returns is that, and hence the title, The Returns, is that he, years before, had stopped painting as a career, a visual arts career, after a terrible kind of car accident. And he wants to return to that because he feels that that is a part of his life that he hasn't managed to come to terms with. And Elizabeth, as it happens, is a book editor. And she has been working as a freelance book editor, doing the smaller jobs rather than the large, full-on editorial in-house jobs, which she used to do. And so she is considering that there's something missing in her life. So in both cases, these are two parts of their actual professional existence, if you like, that they want to catch up on or go back to, return to, and do properly, perhaps. The main thing about the two characters, Trevor and Elizabeth, or Elizabeth and Trevor, we should give her priority. It's her house that they both live in. Is that they have become acutely aware of how life is uncertain and how that we are sort of placed in this existence, which is uncertainty, going through life, and how anything you do or don't do in your past is left behind. You can't change it in the sense that it remains as it was, but it follows you. In other words, it follows you as emotional kinds of returns and recurrences. And anything about it that is disturbing to you, obviously, can haunt. And they're not terribly traumatized, but they have been, in their own different ways, rejected and, if you like, let run adrift a little. And they've both done less well, if you like, in their lives. In their terms, I think they've done less well. And it matters to them that, firstly, their lives seem to have led them into this loneliness state. They're both, in effect, single. Elizabeth is single, and it's not stated over much why, but obviously she has a daughter. There was a father at some point, a husband or partner, and Trevor's just had a divorce, and it's quite clear that his divorce was always going to happen. But once again, it's only briefly referred to. But the two of them then meet, both of them wanting to return to their own personal careers in a different way, and both wanting really to perhaps to grow as themselves. And the thing about it is that by being together, by me as the writer putting these two characters together, I've allowed them in the story, therefore, to develop side by side. They actually end up stimulating each other to do more. At the same time, they're really quite puzzled by each other. They don't necessarily understand each other. It's just that they can, get ideas from each other and reassurances, I think, that other people are like this, and it's worth doing. The sense of going back also becomes ironic because they both have it individually. One parent still alive who was a bugbear, and these parents cause a lot of trouble in the piece, and for both of them, in very different ways. And they find out they can discuss the nature of being children with very strange, eccentric, and not very good mother and father figures. Reposopagnosia is a very strange condition indeed. I mean, it's one of these neurological conditions that doesn't seem to have much explanation. Some people have had it because of something that happened when they were very young. Others just have it. And face blindness really is as crazy as it sounds. The person cannot recognize another person just by looking at their face. They may recognize them in other ways. So in theory, if Elizabeth saw her mother just as we are looking at each other, say in a Zoom session or on camera or just ahead, she wouldn't recognize her. If her mother stood still, she wouldn't see her mother. She'd just see a person, you know, a body. But so it's all the salient features, you know, of other kinds. So the sensory details that come through. Now, Trevor, because of his very serious car accident long ago in his past, has had an extremely damaged leg, which he still limps on. So Elizabeth quite quickly realizes that, you know, Trevor is the big man with a shiny bald head and a very severe limp. And the kind of irony here is that the only way Elizabeth really picks him up quickly is by looking at his limp. The thing about the limp is that is the bodily record of the trauma that Trevor went through, another one, which is a terrible car accident, which he feels extremely guilty about and remains troubled by, but it's also there with him. So he carries that around on one side of his body. And that's the bit that Elizabeth says, oh, you're Trevor, I can see you limping badly in your particular way. But she also has always had this, and I'd just like to read a section from an earlier part of her life. Elizabeth's mother had been a member of the Rajneeshi sect or cult, and the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh was the great seducer of people. He was actually an extraordinarily brilliant man, but whether he was a true mystic, I think, is very doubtful. But he was incredibly learned, he was very erudite, and he had extraordinary charisma. They said when he gave sessions to, you know, 1,000 people, his force in the room would be so great their teeth would chatter. He actually had, you know, a bodily reaction manifest in them. Anyway, so in effect, Elizabeth's mother is thinking that she would join these people, and when she does, she's actually a very self-centered person, and she thinks that she's very superior, as a lot of the Rajneeshis tended to do. Thought that they were extremely wonderful people, well ahead of everyone else, the riffraff. But Elizabeth was left by herself. She had one friend who was called Mali, who was one of the Rajneeshis. So they thought they were the eternal class of superior beings. Except for young Elizabeth, sitting and wandering among them, they all blurred in together. All the sannyasin looked the same, every one of them. They were not special. She was the nadir of an irony. They knew about Elizabeth's rare neurological condition of prosopagnosia, and yet it surprised them, these humble and not so humble seekers after God, to realize this condition rendered her so face-blind, she couldn't distinguish one sannyasin from another. They were rendered equal. Prosopagnosia had reduced them to the same level of advancement. Their souls were all the same. If God and the Bhagwan and her father had sat side by side in the same orange robes, she could not have told them apart. Instead, she had to memorize them by other means. When they were all long-haired and bearded, the men, and all long-haired and blossoming, the women, they were astonishingly similar, impossible for her to tell apart. Her mother's voice had always been the main identifier, and then one new difference, her hair was close cropped and sometimes shorn. Elizabeth told Marley she had a private joke about this blank face thing. He asked what, and she told him. God has prosopagnosia too, she said. All his children are equal, and they're all the same. No one was any better than another. You are a chip off the old block, he said, somewhat startled, given he meant her mother. This sounded decidedly inept to Elizabeth. She told him at least she knew now what irony was and how it was brought on by having a mother. She noticed he had stopped laughing. Well, the thing about Elizabeth's mother was that she was so keen on being a Rajneeshi that she was indifferent to looking after a very, you know, a prepubescent and pubescent daughter, just at the time when the mother might have been a very significant influence in her daughter's life. The mother was out there being inspired, or thinking she was. And she used to say because her daughter wanted to be a gymnast. The daughter said, you know, that she did routines just like the Rajneeshis did routines. And her mother says, in effect, yes, but routines like that are for losers. Our routines are for the mind, not the body. So this is not a very nice thing to say to a daughter, but, you know, that was her attitude. She was just so concerned to consider her own spiritual development, if it was that she forgot about her daughters. So Elizabeth has to struggle now with the fact that she's looking after an aged mother, the same woman who now needs her care, and Elizabeth gives it. So the irony here is, of course, really obvious that while Elizabeth never received much care, she is now the one providing the care for her mother. And Trevor understands this, and they both make jokes about it, and those jokes, you know, are rewarding in the sense that they reinforce Elizabeth's own sense of doing the right thing, but also the ironies of having to do so. Trevor's father returns from obscurity after 30 odd years of having been a disappeared person, perhaps. And eventually he discovers that what really his father's come back for is the money that Trevor inherited from him. And, you know, so they both understand, if you like, the difficulties of having these difficult parents. But they also come to terms with each other's different current work, which is that Trevor is now painting in Elizabeth's backyard, in the garage or the shed, now a studio, and Elizabeth is doing the editing that she always wanted to do. So they have a little discussion. She goes out to look at one of his paintings, and this is just a scene where they discuss that. He asks her what she thinks of it. She says the impact of his work banks up in her. Each painting is so big and busy. She says how a painting is all there at once, at attention, everywhere you look, and you can look everywhere. It's a tautology of itself, being all present all the time. Whereas you read one sentence at a time, running page by page, linear. These moments are fairly seamless, like consciousness is, moving forwards in time. You comprehend its cause and effect and its coherence. Whenever you pause or put the book down, the awareness of what came before returns into awareness. Reading is always this elegant moving forward and catching up. It accretes. As if an answer, one painting is skewing shelf above shelf of book spines into something like twisted laddering or fragments of cuneiform. His shop and maybe his shape changing. The faces are of public people, he says, and people I've seen from around here. So each face in the overall picture has a story. They're barely even likenesses, but tell me if you can recognize anyone. Are they faces Elizabeth knows but cannot name? Are some of them her? What does a portrait of her look like to her? Then she sees him smirking. Jesus, Trevor, she says, and walks inside. Because, of course, she can't recognize any of the faces. And he knows it. He sort of set up the question deadpan. And so they have this interplay with each other, this kind of friendly joshing of each other. You know, they are good for each other. They're friends who have met by chance. Let's say they have people who've met by chance who become friends and kind of supports for each other. And that becomes, if you like, the second part, the drive within the novel, the way friendship and work can go side by side. I'm a great believer in both of these things. Friendship, I don't think I'm a very good friend, but I really value what friendship is. And I like writing about it. And I think I'm better at work, and I write about work too and value it, because a lot of people don't. You know, work is sometimes the thing, talking of backstories and novels, a lot of characters don't seem to go to work. They don't seem to have a source of their daily income. Well, I always find that part of the backstory that's rather, you know, intriguing. Why isn't it there? Why, when it's so central to most people's existence, why do characters in novels often not seem to have a job? I think I particularly like characters who are outsiders. So my last two novels in particular follow that through. Waiting was about people who lived in rooming houses, people who, talking of backgrounds, don't have jobs. They may not even be working class at all. They are people who are outsided by illnesses, by poverty, by difficulty, by all sorts of reasons that people end up in rooming houses, in supported, if you like, existences, and who live a kind of different life. They really are living in a way that's outside the mainstream in a very big way, even though they're right there amongst us. They don't have the reassurance of the next day's securities. They don't have the certainties, if you like, that I was suggesting earlier. Though in the midst of uncertainty, they are living a lot of uncertainty. But they have each other, hopefully. And so in the returns, Trevor and Elizabeth are outsiders in that they are loners. They don't fit into the mainstream. They're both involved in the arts in some way or another. Trevor actively, but not professionally. Elizabeth is an editor, but she is an unseen presence, therefore, because editors are the forgotten people of literature. And they make much of this between themselves, that, you know, Trevor says, well, what's it feel like to be an editor if you're functioning outside of the public sphere, but you are vital in many ways, and sometimes incredibly vital and important to a book or a whole series of books. And she says, well, that's all very well for you to ask that question. You're doing all these paintings in my backyard. No one's ever going to see. So, you know, they have their jokes at each other's expense. But the fact is, they have, I've realized for them anyway, that their earlier careers were public. Trevor began an art career. He had one exhibition that did brilliantly well before his accident that made him question whether, in fact, being a painter was a frivolous and unimportant thing, considering that people can be seriously injured and even die from accidents, which he may have caused. And Elizabeth has been a major editor, but Elizabeth has been a major book editor, but she seems to have, along the way, it's never quite sure why, done something wrong or fallen out of favor or decided she doesn't like that particular role in that particular way. And so both of them have had public careers, and they now want to return personally to what they did before, rather than very publicly. And so it's what they did and what they have done now is found work. And that work is for them to develop themselves, so they can work on themselves personally and do the work. So I believe also in writing about people who are searching for and hopefully find some medium, whatever it might be, where intense involvement in that medium grows them personally. Not just the work. Maybe the work itself isn't important. Maybe the doing of the work is what is important. And this is anti, to some degree, or slightly subversive of the idea of art being this extraordinary, wonderful thing. And it's, you know, through great inspiration, the artwork exists. Art essentially comes from work. And the artist is working in two ways, because they're working both on the work and on themselves. And one of the ironies of being an artist is often what's left behind is the finished work which the world gets. The artist can often be, and forgetful, let's say. The artist can be forgetful of their insights in their own work. And I find that intriguing. I've written about that quite a lot. I've also written about people who disappear. So in Elizabeth's case, her mother is a disappearing person without actually physically going away. She just isn't there emotionally or personally. Trevor's father has disappeared. He's just gone. No one knows what's happened to him. He actually took himself off and left Australia and went to Europe. He was Polish and he went back to live in Poland. And Trevor's early family life, which was very distinctly Polish and therefore, you know, aware of that background, has had developed into a future where his Polishness is gone because his father has gone and disappeared, and his mother has been so upset by the father's disappearance that her life has been blighted by it. So disappearances of those kinds. I've also written a novel earlier called Toccata and Rain, which is about a person who has a dissociation where he disappears from himself. So he enters a fugue state of amnesia and becomes another person. And behind me on my bookshelf up here is my new book called The Fifth Season, which is about missing persons. And so the idea of people going away forever, going away and returning, losing some part of themselves is missing, and returning to that is also, you know, right across all my books. It's also scattered throughout my poetry. And the other thing is, oddly enough, I have displaced my male characters. So in my first novel, my second novel, in my fourth novel, and flirted with in my third novel, are the idea of a man leaving the place he might live in and going to live as a lodger or a tenant in someone else's house. And that, to me, I hadn't planned on doing that, but that seems to be something that's very strange. And I think what it does is it allows you a fresh start for the character. So it's actually just a literary device. But there's something about being elsewhere, you know, taken away from myself. And so, in a sense, there's another part of the story which is missing, and that's the backstory that you don't want as a writer to provide your characters. That's gone missing. But in my new novel, the one called The Fifth Season, the missingness is there to be resolved. Will the story of the novel give the answer to the missing? Does a missing person reappear? Is there a reason for someone going missing? And these questions are very profound, and of course, in most cases, are empty. They're not filled with an answer. And I think the part of literature that gives answers is very profound. But literature's role is also to remind us there are things which are unanswerable and which are unknown. And we won't, and they remain uncertain, and we live with it. And to me, that's a profoundly important drive to write. In other words, to look for answers, but also to acknowledge that we don't always find them.